Hey everybody, it's Joe from greenlightsound.com, and today we're going to take a look at a collection of EQ and preamp models from NoiseAsh, the Neve EQ and preamp collection that we have here. And we're going to go through a bunch of the different models, and these are all, of course, based upon classic Neve EQ and preamps. Now, when you think of Neve EQs, you really think musical EQ with a lot of mojo to them. And you hear that word musical tossed around a lot in terms of EQ, and to me it means a few things. First, there's some type of analog modeling going on that adds some harmonics to the signal. Number two, generally the curves are going to be really broad. It's going to be bigger than you think. You're not really seeing the curves on the screen because you just have the knobs to choose from, but the really broad, wide curves. And number three, especially with Neves, the filter frequencies are really well selected, especially on certain sources. You just dial in certain frequencies and it's in the right spot to either push up the signal or pull a little bit out. So let's dive right in, looking first at the Neve 73 based upon the absolute classic Neve 1073. We have the preamp side right over here and a few controls. This is the classic red preamp Neve knob, but we have pre on or off. We have a 20 dB pad if we want to use it, a polarity reverse, and this drive off or on. When you put the drive on, you can push the preamp and get the saturation out of it without boosting the signal like the preamp in real life would actually do. Or we could turn that off and really boost the signal with that. We've got the low shelf selectable frequencies, the high shelf, which is fixed to 12K on these, two mid bands, which is a really nice feature to have. We have our faders here for pulling the output signal down. We also have purely digital input and output down at the bottom and a width control. We have the option to use mid-side mode if we want to, an analog noise selector, and this nuanced deviation, which gives a slightly different curve and response to the different channels modeled here as if you had a real console out in front of you, where each channel might have been slightly different depending on the tolerances of the components. So let's hear this thing in action. Right away, we're going to hear it on a snare drum part. I'm going to bypass the entire plugin now, and let's just hear the snare by itself. So in terms of processing, I just boosted a little bit of that preamp drive. I put the filter in at 80 Hertz. I've boosted a bit at 110 for some of that snare body, pulled out some of that boxiness around 700 Hertz, pushed up a bit of mid-range at 3.2K and put some of that top shelf on there, and now we get this. I'll bypass it on and off as it plays. Really opens it up for sure. If I turn the EQ off and just look at the preamp section here, we can really push it. Totally destroy it if we want to. And of course, having that drive control on is nice that we can push it that hard and not have the gain increase a ton. The next EQ we're going to look at here is the Neve 81 console EQ based upon the Neve 1081. And we've got a few more options here. The preamp section is pretty much the same. Now we've got both high and low pass filtering. We have different selections of frequency bands for our two mid-range bands. We have a selectable frequency on the top band, which is different, and just slightly different curves to everything here. So we're going to listen to this on an overhead part, and let's listen to it with the EQ and preamp bypassed completely. In terms of processing for this one, a little bit of preamp drive. I didn't cut anything out on the low pass filter here, but for the high pass filter, I have it at 82 Hertz. The low band pushing a tad at 180, cutting a little bit out at 820, cutting a little bit out at 2.2K for that sort of papery snare sound that I'm hearing, and then pushing up a little high end at 15K, and here's what we get with the processing. I'll bypass it on and off as it plays. Not a huge amount of EQ going on here, but enough to get rid of that kind of papery upper mid-range sound that was in there. The next preamp EQ we're going to look at here is the Neve 84, based upon the Neve 1084, basically like big brother of the 1073 here, really similar layout. We've got our preamp as usual, high and low pass filtering, the low, mid, and upper bands here with a few more options than the 1073. And we're going to hear this one on a bass part. So here's the bass part by itself with no processing at all. And the processing, again, little preamp drive here, actually a little bit more than the others. We've got some low pass, 14K, high pass, 45 Hertz, pushing quite a bit at 110 for that bottom end of the bass, pulling out about 700 Hertz, really boosting that 1.6K for that bass aggressiveness. And I'm not doing anything on the top band here. Here's what we get with processing. Yeah, this really shines on the bass part, especially that preamp drive. I'll bypass it on and off as it plays. And we could really push that drive if we wanted to fuzz out the bass completely. Or just bring it right to the edge of clipping. So this sounds really great on the bass part. And speaking of sort of driving things, we can also take a look at our preamp collection here. This is the Neve Pre Trilogy, which has just the preamp section of the 73, 81, and 84 models here. And on bass, for example, it'd be a great one to use because we can push up that drive and get that kind of fuzzy bass sound. And then swap out the different models for what we like best. And each has a slightly different characteristic to it and probably a little bit of boost and EQ too happening because of the way the saturation is affecting the signal. There's also a Neve 31102 preamp we can try. And again, different character, all depending on what type of saturation you want to have. Speaking of the 31102, here it is, a totally different looking console channel strip, but still another classic Neve. This one's really well known for being part of Andrew Shep's workflow for years. He used the console with this EQ in it. And we have a preamp section, of course. We've got our high and low pass filters, low, 2 mid bands, and high bands with a high Q selectable too. This is a piano part. Let's bypass the processing and see what it sounds like. With the processing, I'm not really using any preamp on this one. Got a little bit of filtering on the high and low end going on. Pulling out a little bit at 60 Hertz. I don't want that low end in the mix. Pulling out a little bit at 700 Hertz as well. Boosting 3.2K and boosting 10K. That's going to allow the upper end to cut through when it's in a full mix here. Here it is with processing. I'll bypass it on and off as it plays, starting with it on. And you might think to yourself, the dry signal, the unaffected signal sounds a little bit richer and fuller. It does, but you really sometimes don't want that in the mix when you have a piano part with a bunch of other instruments playing. A solo piano, absolutely, you might want that. But in the mix, that's going to muddy things up. So it was nice to cut some of that out with this 31102 EQ. The last EQ we're going to look at in the collection is probably the most flexible or versatile because it's got the most control. This is the Neve 533, based upon a Neve Portico EQ. Definitely a newer model than the 1073s and 81s and 84s. And this one I'm going to use on an acoustic guitar part, stereo acoustic guitar. I'm going to bypass the plugin first. Here's what it sounds like. In terms of processing in this one, there's a lot more to choose from, but I have high pass filter just above 100 Hertz or so. I'm cutting out a little bit at 171, doing nothing with this low mid filter. For the mid range, I'm boosting up that 1.6 range pretty heavily for a lot of that pick attack. Boosting again at 7K and boosting one more time on the very top end at 8.4K. After I did that boost, I'm pulling out a little bit more of the top end here with a low pass filter, and here's what we get with the processing. Again, cutting out a ton of that low end and boosting the upper range to cut through the mix. Here it is on and off, starting with it on. And if it's cutting out too much of that bottom end, we can pull the filters back a bit. Bring a little bit more of that body back in with the upper mid and high range push. And this one has the ability to really add some nice air because it goes all the way up to 25K. So you can put it somewhere around 20 or so. Actually around 16, and that boosting by 12 dB doesn't sound like an obnoxious 12 dB boost in the upper end. It really just sounds like a lot of air on the signal. I'll turn that band on and off. It's almost like a presence control. Really nice feature of this EQ. So there we have it. NoiseAsh's Neve EQs and preamps. Really fantastic sounding analog models here. Really fun to play around with. And if you're used to using purely digital EQs where you're actually seeing the transfer curve, it's nice to get away from that sometimes and just, turn some knobs and do what sounds right rather than what you think looks right. If you're interested in checking them out, I'll leave a link in the description down below. That'll take you over to NoiseAsh's website and you can check them out for yourself. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down in the comment section. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already, so we can keep you in the loop as to what's coming up next, and I'll see you in the next one.